So given these ideas that were circulating among Americans and Britons in the late 1700s, do you have some like off-the-cuff initial ideas about why the Army had insufficient amounts of saltpeter or gunpowder?
They didn't know how to make it.
They didn't know how to make it. They think this stuff is growing out, or there's living rocks underground. How are you going to make something if you think, how are you going to make a podium if you think this podium like grows out of the ground?
I would love to introduce tonight's speaker. Professor David Hsiung is a professor at Juniata College and is here to speak to us tonight about a very revolutionary topic, saltpeter and gunpowder. And one of our audience members said to me earlier, I don't know anything about saltpeter. And I love that. That's what I want here, because I don't know so much about that either. No pressure, Dave. But we're all here to learn about this really interesting topic, one of George Washington's biggest challenges, I think. And without further ado, I would love to introduce tonight's speaker, Dave Hsiung. Dave.
Thank you very much, Steve. Can you hear me okay? Cheap seats in the back? Okay. Thank you, Steve, for inviting me here to speak. Thank you, Lowell Institute, all the folks there. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy days to come to the museum and to hear me talk. This museum is not dedicated to the American Revolution, but they invited me to come talk to you because, well, as you well know, it's the 250th anniversary of the Revolution. On April 19, you saw the 250th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord, which started the War of Independence. There was a lot of attention to that anniversary here. Yeah, okay. In a couple of weeks, you'll see the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill. You're probably already up to your eyeballs with this 250th stuff. But buckle up. The next 6, 7, 8 years, you're going to see a succession of one event after another getting its 250th anniversary. What I'd like to do is give you what I hope will be some different ways to think about the Revolution and the War of Independence. Okay? I study the war by drawing upon environmental history. And by that I mean the interaction between humans and nature in an ongoing, dynamic relationship. Humans change nature, that changed nature changes humans, and back and forth. Okay? Let's start by looking at environmental history and war from a broad perspective. If you think about the words environment and war, and you put them together, how does one word affect the other? So let's start by thinking about the environment's effects on war. Think broadly, think whatever time period, whatever part of the globe. Do you have any examples of environment affecting war? Yeah. D-Day invasion. There are storms in the English Channel that delayed and almost canceled the invasion of D-Day. Yes, ma'am? Battle of Trenton. So the environment of what is affected?
The Delaware River, the reason the Hessians were in Trenton in the first place is because,
the ice-clogged Delaware River. Any other examples of environment affecting war?
Every year we hear the spring offensive in the Ukrainian.
Spring offensive, okay. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and the waiting until spring to launch something. Yes, one more.
Napoleon's invasion of Russia.
Never invade Russia in the winter. All right, that's a bad idea. Okay, what about we reverse the relationship of the words war's effect on the environment? Does something come to mind? Flanders Field. Can you elaborate?
Well, after everything was destroyed, the poppies were the only things that were growing.
Okay, so in the Great War, World War I, the effect of artillery on the landscape, obliterating everything, and what can grow back afterwards. Okay, one more.
Hiroshima
What is war's effect on the environment if we drop the atomic bomb? And yes, okay. Okay, Agent Orange in Vietnam. The role of defoliants like that. Okay. Okay, and today maybe you think about Gaza and the Ukraine, the threat to Ukraine's nuclear power plants. Okay, so the war's effect on the environment is clearly not limited to the early modern period. Okay, so my research doesn't focus so much on climate, like D-Day, or terrain. The jungles of Vietnam meant we got to get rid of the foliage so we can see stuff. I'm looking at something a little bit different. Smaller parts of tangible, material nature, and looking at them as at their scientific properties. How does knowing about biology, chemistry, ecology, or geology help us understand how and why humans acted the way they did? Okay? So when doing this kind of research, historians, me included, we have to start each time with a hypothesis. We say to ourselves, I think this happened for these reasons. And then you make a plan for your research, and you think it will take you where you want to go. Okay? But although you start with a hypothesis, sometimes you wind up someplace else. Okay? You have to be open to the possibility that it won't turn out the way you expect. So let me tell you what happened to me. Okay? As you know, the war started on April 19th with Lexington and Concord. And before that day was over, those few dozen Minutemen on Lexington Green were soon joined by hundreds and then thousands of other militiamen who pushed British soldiers back to Boston and then blockaded them there. And pretty soon, militia and soldiers from lots of colonies showed up outside of Boston. And the question soon arose, how are we going to supply the Continental Army? Or how are we going to supply the Continental Army? And in terms of ammunition, the answer was not very well. There was a consistent shortage of gunpowder, and that affected the Continental Army's ability to wage war. Okay? On June 17, there was the Army was successful at Bunker Hill until it ran out of gunpowder during British Army's third assault up the hill. By early August 1775, the Continental Army had only 38 barrels of gunpowder on hand, so that each of the 17,000 soldiers in the Army had enough for only 9 rounds apiece. Okay. When George Washington, the commander-in-chief, was told about this predicament, Brigadier General John Sullivan wrote, "General Washington was so struck that he did not utter a word for half an hour." Now, for the entire war, American forces had to rely on imports from France for gunpowder because it never had enough domestically produced gunpowder. Now, historians have offered lots of reasons why, and today I want to focus on saltpeter, though. David Cressy, a notable historian, wrote the book Saltpeter, The Mother of Gunpowder, published in 2013, and he makes several claims. First, those who made saltpeter would do so with like patriotic enthusiasm. He stated, "It would be a work of freedom, not oppression or vexation, to supply the revolution with home-sourced material for munitions." That's one argument. A second, the work was voluntary, collaborative, and cooperative, with an open exchange of knowledge among various colonies. And third, there was a shortage because the work was more difficult than amateur enthusiasts envisaged, and the output suffered from poor quality control. Domestic supplies came in slower than anticipated, and the homemade saltpeter had high contaminations of common salt. Okay? So I had to ask, is Cressy right? And what does an approach of environmental history tell us about this kind of argument? But first, I should back up and ask you, what is gunpowder? Now, I wrote this down before coming here. I talked to some of you before the curtain rose here. Some of you make gunpowder, so I'm going to ask you to wait first. I'm not going to call on the eager beavers first, but I know I've got some plants in the audience here who can help me out. Do you know the ingredients of gunpowder? Give me one of them. Potassium. Saltpeter is one of them. Yes. A second ingredient. I think I heard charcoal. Yes. And there's one more. Sulfur. Okay. Sulfur starts the ignition. Charcoal is the stuff that burns. And saltpeter is the substance that, when it's heated, provides the oxygen that pushes the musket ball out the muzzle. The ratio of the gunpowder, of the ingredients in gunpowder is 1:6. So saltpeter makes up 75% of gunpowder's weight. Okay? Now, what is saltpeter? Potassium nitrate. Okay? Or the symbol is KNO3. Now that seems pretty straightforward today, but what did Americans in 1775 think saltpeter was? So John Mayow was an English medical chemist in the 1600s whose ideas were popular in Europe, in Britain, and in America in the 1700s. He said saltpeter was generated in the bosom of the earth from the living seed of nitrous salts. So think about that for a second. Saltpeter was generated in the bosom of the earth, underground, from the living seed of nitrous salts. Okay? Many Americans believed in the term they used, a transcendent God, okay? And that God created and directed what they called animate nature. The earth was living, and metals and stones grew underground. Okay? Mayow also believed that the earth had a universal spirit called spiritus mundi, and that spirit could get exhausted. Saltpeter was the source of soil fertility and would get sucked out of the ground as plants grew. Okay? So therefore, decaying plant matter, which had saltpeter, because it sucked it out of the ground, would return to that substance to the earth and help improve this universal spirit. Okay? Any questions about this so far? This is not what you learned in 9th grade bio, right? Okay. Kenelm Digby wrote Discourse Concerning the Vegetation of Plants, 1660. He says saltpeter acted as a magnet that attracts other saltpeter floating around in the atmosphere. What do you think about that? Okay, we're going to have some stuff here. And similarly, Jared Elliott, in Essays upon Field Husbandry, 1760, advised farmers to plant cabbages, turnips, and peas before winter wheat so that the shade would increase the air motion and sweep in the saltpeter from the atmosphere. Okay? So I call these kind of like crazy ideas. It's not maybe the best term to use, but they don't follow modern science. Okay? According to my geology colleagues at Juniata College, there are not living seeds deep underground that create potassium nitrate. Okay? They assure me there is no potassium nitrate floating around in the atmosphere. There are wildfires in Canada that is putting a lot of stuff in the atmosphere that's sweeping through New England, but there is not naturally occurring potassium nitrate. And there's having some on the ground does not attract floating potassium nitrate. Okay? So given these ideas that were circulating among Americans and Britons in the late 1700s, do you have some like off-the-cuff initial ideas about why the Army had insufficient amounts of saltpeter or gunpowder? They didn't know how to make it. They think this stuff is growing out, or there's living rocks underground. How are you going to make something if you think, how are you going to make a podium if you think this podium like grows out of the ground? You're going to mess up, right? You're not going to make saltpeter correctly. So that was basically my hypothesis. Continental Army never had enough domestically produced gunpowder because Americans did not understand saltpeter. That misunderstanding meant they produced inferior quality saltpeter and therefore poor quality gunpowder, or they didn't produce enough quantities of good, acceptable saltpeter, which again leads to insufficient quantities, supplies of gunpowder. Okay? If you don't know the basic you don't understand the basic substance correctly, you're not going to make it right, or you're not going to make it enough of it, was my hypothesis. Okay? And so primary sources from the war seem to support this hypothesis. It supported the ideas that the Mayo and all those other folks were circulating. In 1775, the Continental Congress published instructions for making saltpeter. You know, like in our post-9/11 world, it might be hard to imagine a time when the government told people how to make explosives. Okay? Like, we need you to do this. Okay? They published this pamphlet. Okay? So let me give you some snippets from the first recipe in their pamphlet. Okay? Saltpeter is to be found in tobacco houses, stables, cow houses, hen and pigeon houses, and in any covered place where the influence of the sun seldom reaches. Okay? In order to prepare the floors for attracting niter, another word for saltpeter, all dung and other trash must be removed, and if the floors are not level, they must be made so. Okay? And once the floor is prepared, sprinkle strong amber, which is another word for tobacco juice, over the ground, made from tobacco trash, which are stalks and leaves, and cover it with wet ground leaves and other tobacco trash for a fortnight. A fortnight is 2 weeks. Then clean out the trash, and in any cool, dry morning that follows, you will find on the floor the niter attracted and condensed like hoar frost. Like sometimes on like your windshield, in the winter. That first yellow highlight mentions removing dung and trash. I just highlight it because I want you to remember this. I'm going to come back to it. Okay? The second yellow highlight, sprinkling the amber and spreading the tobacco trash, that's the idea of attracting saltpeter. Okay? In the steps that follow in this recipe, they talk about taking that soil, putting it into a pot, pouring water through it, collecting the solution that comes out, and boiling it. Okay? More on that later, but here's the next snippet. Then put the liquor, the boiled liquid, out of the pot into wetted wooden trays and set it by in a cool place for the first growth. What do you think growth refers to? It refers to crystals, saltpeter crystals. Okay? When your trays have stood with the suds a few hours, you must raise one end and let the lee, the solution, drain off from the saltpeter, which is the first growth, and by boiling a second time, will yield you a fresh quantity. After it is thus drained and become dry, you may put it into casks or tubs until you have leisure, without prejudice to your crops, take care of your crops first, to refine it. Okay? I'm going through this in some detail because this is a museum about industry and innovation, and you're all about like the details of how stuff is made. Okay? The gray highlight, that speaks to the idea of saltpeter circulating in the air, and that having saltpeter in a tray will attract the stuff in the air, which leads to this next paragraph. The earth from which you have extracted the saltpeter and all the washings of your vessels, if you lay it by thinly spread in your house, will turn to profit, as it continues to be peculiarly proper to attract and absorb the niter, saltpeter, floating in the air, and also the earthly matter which settles in the refining. All right. Okay, this pamphlet that Congress put out had this as the lead-off recipe, but it had other recipes, other commentary on recipes in it. So the second, another item in this pamphlet is from Benjamin Rush, a noted scientist and doctor of this time, and he's commenting on German methods for making saltpeter. Okay? Kramer, a German chemist of considerable note, recommends the following method of making saltpeter, which he says is practiced with great success in many parts of Germany. Okay? He orders lime, rubbish of all kinds, garden mold, and ashes to be mixed together and moistened from time to time with urine, care being taken to stir them frequently. They should be all put into a small house with a window towards the northeast. He does not direct this because the nitrous particles are brought in from that quarter, but that's the idea. There's saltpeter floating in the air. But because the winds from the northeast in that country are generally accompanied with that temperature of the air, which is most agreeable to the formation of the niter. Okay. So the yellow highlight, put all that organic material on the ground and add in urine. Recall that the first recipe says remove all that dung and trash. Okay. One more example from William Whiting of New York, also published in this pamphlet. He refers to a Dr. Graham, and he ends up contradicting Benjamin Rush. He procured the earth from under old buildings which had no cellars, but he always avoided stables and other places where the earths were impregnated with urinous and excrementitious salts. That's a Scrabble bonus word there. Okay. You are to avoid soil that was impregnated with that nasty stuff, which contradicts Benjamin Rush, who said, add urine. Okay? So you're getting contradictory instructions in this material that the Congress is sending out. And so I think this supports my hypothesis that Congress sent out confusing instructions that were based on the quote-unquote crazy ideas they had about saltpeter. Okay. But I also looked at a wider range of sources, which included publications from the committees of safety from Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and a bunch of newspapers from Virginia. This information was freely circulating. That's one of the points David Cressy made. When I looked at the steps of the extraction and refinement process, what I found was they followed a pretty consistent set of guidelines, even though there were some variations. First, take soil from a covered place, put it in a tub that has a drain at the bottom. Okay. Pour water in, which dissolves the saltpeter and other compounds. Okay. Drain off the solution, pour it through wood ashes and straw. Okay. Boil that liquid, scoop off any scum that floats to the top, let it cool in trays. With time, saltpeter crystals form. Okay. Then to refine the crystals, boil it again, let it cool again, allow that recrystallization. Impurities will either come to the top or sink to the bottom, which you can easily remove. Okay. Again, there were some variations among these different sets of instructions. Some said pour hot water into the tub. Others were okay with cold. I'm going to ask you at the end here what might be the effect of these different suggestions. Hot water versus cold. Some said let the water sit in the tub for 24 hours. Others said just pour it through. Okay. Some insisted on pouring it through wood ashes, while others didn't mention ashes at all. Okay. So do you have any ideas of what these variations might mean, why it might matter to use hot water or cold, to let it sit for 24 hours or not sit, to pour it through wood ashes? Effects on the strength, like why do you think? So the idea was it affects the strength. So is there something in the variation that gets you thinking that it affects the strength?
Depends on the time that it's treated.
Yeah. This is Boston. Anyone drink tea? Do you feel strongly how long you leave the tea bag in the mug? How long? Till you 5 minutes, 3 minutes? You don't just like pour the hot water in and take the tea bag out. Okay, so the longer you let the water sit in the tub, 24 hours, it's going to be stronger. Okay? This is Boston. Anyone drink hot chocolate? Okay, you scoop the hot chocolate in and it like sits on the top of the cup, annoyingly sits on the top of the cup. Does it make any difference if the milk is hot or cold? Yeah, which is better? Hot. The stuff dissolves more quickly when it's hot. So pouring hot water into the pot with the dirt would probably dissolve out the potassium nitrate or whatever that's in the soil more quickly or more completely than would cold water. Okay? I'll talk about wood ashes in a second. Well, let's talk about it now. Who cares about this outline? Okay. Wood ashes has potassium in it. Potassium doesn't occur in high concentrations naturally in soils in New England. So if you want to have more potassium in your solution, it makes sense to pour hot water through wood ashes so some of that potassium dissolves in it. After all, saltpeter is potassium nitrate. Okay? So why didn't Washington have enough gunpowder? Why was there a shortage of saltpeter? Maybe too many people followed the cold water, pour it straight through, no ashes recipes, and not enough followed the hot water or 24 hours or wood ashes recipes. Okay? Modern science validates these general instructions. Just about any soil in eastern United States doesn't have much nitrogen because plants naturally suck it up and water easily leaches it away. So anything you do to add nitrogen to the soil, to the mixture, is gonna help. And that's why taking soils from stables where livestock or animals have peed and pooped, that's going to add more nitrogen. Okay? That's why adding tobacco leaves have more nitrogen in them than some other plants. Okay, so lay those down on the ground. Animal dung and urine contains ammonia, which can't be made into saltpeter, but soils in the New England region, in the east, have certain bacteria, nitrosinoma, nitrobacter, that oxidize ammonia and makes more nitrate available. Okay? Now, I'm not going to go into the science of the solubility of compounds, like why the bad stuff floats to the top like scum or sinks to the bottom. That has to do with solubility of different chemicals. And I'm not going to go into details about lattice structure. In the crystals, the saltpeter crystals, they form a kind of lattice, which means more saltpeter can like fit in there, but non-saltpeter stuff can't get in there. So it remains pure. They don't have the right key to get in there. Okay? So many Americans have these crazy ideas about how saltpeter gets formed, but their methods for making saltpeter are appropriate if enough people follow the right recipes. The analogy I come up with is my car. I open the hood of my car and I look at that engine and I have no idea how anything works there. But I know that if I change the oil every 5,000 miles, it's gonna keep humming along, okay? I might think some magic stuff happens under the hood of the car, and that's totally wrong. And I'm saying this in a museum of industry and innovation, but change the oil, it's gonna work. So by understanding the science behind the technology and the procedures, we go back to Cressy's arguments. There's no reason to think that we have to accept that homemade saltpeter had high contaminations of common salt. The procedures should have purified the saltpeter in ways that modern science says, hey, that's good. Okay? So with this research, I had to change my hypothesis. It's no longer the idea, okay, they had crazy ideas about saltpeter and that's why they made insufficient quantities of good saltpeter. I had to change my hypothesis. So what else might explain the shortage of domestically produced saltpeter if you can't blame it on crazy ideas? Do you have any ideas? Yes, sir.
Some of the distances involved, it was probably difficult to ship.
Okay, so, okay, Okay, a question of logistics, moving the saltpeter. Hey, I've got 5 tons of saltpeter here. How am I going to get it to the Continental Army? Okay, bad roads, weak oxen, no wagons, something like that. Any other ideas?
Keeping it dry.
Keeping it dry. Okay, you make the saltpeter, but then it gets messed up. Okay, any other ideas?
Were there enough volunteers making it?
Okay,
They got their own work to do.
okay, terrific. One more? Yes, sir. Who's going to pay for it? Okay, okay. Pardon me?
A lot of the colonies were directly on the ocean, with high contamination.
Okay, so the question was, is the location of these salt producing operations by the coast, did that affect it or not? Don't know, okay? Do any of you have kids, teenage or older? Yeah, okay. Why didn't the yard get mowed or the driveway shoveled? You didn't pay them enough? They're lazy. Okay. Or they kind of gave some weaselly answer why they didn't want to do the work. They had something better to do. Okay. So remember that Cressy said it would be a work of freedom, not oppression or vexation, to supply the revolution with home-sourced material for munitions. Okay, they're going to be gung-ho, fired by patriotic fervor, the glorious cause, capital G, capital C. Many colonies had to offer bounties for the delivery of a particular quantity of saltpeter. People were motivated by money. Massachusetts, right here, had the most generous payment, $50 per pound, and for saltpeter delivered between November 1775 and October 1776, there was an additional bounty of 4 shillings if people delivered at least 50 pounds. Did it work? In January 1776, one letter writer said production was going briskly. And in May, after Massachusetts raised the bounty, a different letter writer said, the quantity of saltpeter made and making is incredible. There are also perhaps examples of reasons why people didn't produce enough saltpeter. There were, in other things that the Continental Army needed, like food, there was plenty of examples of fraud and corruption, okay? And there's no reason to think that didn't occur with saltpeter as well. During the Valley Forge winter of 1777 and 1778, some contractors put in their casks dirt and rocks where they should have loaded them up with food. Okay? Now, I have no direct evidence that this kind of fraud happened with saltpeter, but there's circumstantial evidence. In 1775 and 76, many colonies established policies for the inspection of saltpeter made within their boundaries. Okay? There's no smoke without fire, so maybe fraud is involved there. So I started with a hypothesis, and where did I end up? Well, unexpectedly, with a big issue related to the relationship governments have with their citizens. Okay? Here's John Trumbull's famous painting of the Continental Congress. Okay? An important reason why the Army never had enough domestically produced saltpeter was because Congress's hands were tied. Okay? Congress ineffectively administered the war. Maybe you know of economic problems that the nation had. But in part, were inefficient in administering the war because they were unable or unwilling to force Americans to act. Okay? The colonies created the Continental Congress in 1774, but they held on to their sovereignty. The sovereignty remained with those colonies. So Congress could request states to do certain things, but there's no way to make them comply. Okay? Nor was Congress going to push very hard. After all, the rebellion started in part because Britain pushed too hard. Okay? So Congress needed money to run the war, but it couldn't it couldn't tax the people. It could only say to the states, hey, can you tax your people, raise some money, and send it to Congress? So the nature of saltpeter also reinforced what the government could ask, not demand, of the people. Saltpeter had to be coaxed out of the soil. It couldn't just be seized like a herd of cattle, which rebel governments did do. Army needs meat, they're a bunch of cattle, we're going to take them. But you can't just take the saltpeter, you got to get people to make it. Okay? Americans had to be encouraged with bounties, they had to be wooed with patriotic appeals to manufacture saltpeter, and jailing them and fining them for not doing that wasn't going to fill the barrels with gunpowder. So there were limits to what Congress could do, certainly, but it ultimately, came down to the people. Were they going to step up, like some of the people in Massachusetts did, and make lots of saltpeter? Well, it turns out most Americans did not. They did not produce enough saltpeter to make enough gunpowder. This is, therefore, one way of kind of determining that there was low popular support for the war and for independence. Historians typically use many ways to measure popular support during the Revolution. Can you think of any ways to get a pulse of the popular opinion? Pardon me? Enlistments. How many volunteers sign on to join the militia? Any others? Yeah.
See what was being published at the time, newspapers,
Absolutely.
essays.
Yes, absolutely. What kind of printed material? What kind of speeches are given? What kind of votes? What are the results of certain votes? What kind of demonstrations or riots are taking place? So here, the approach of environmental history gives us another method of judging popular opinion, another method to use in our toolbox. The saltpeter problem shows us that the government and the people did not see eye to eye on an important issue. And that has often happened during the 250 years since the Revolution, and I'm pretty sure we're going to continue to see it for the next 250. Thank you for coming tonight. It's coming.
I would love to thank Dave so much, and I would love to have some questions. I will come over to you with the microphone. Please speak into the microphone so the whole audience can hear your question, and we'll give Dave a moment to have a sip of water. And I will come around, and I look forward to hearing your questions. I'll start here and then move over there.
Dave, I just have a question regarding the chemicals, mixtures, and so forth. Gunpowder had been around for a while, and why did it take us so long to come up with the formula? Is it because we didn't have the ingredients, or we couldn't get them? And I know we couldn't buy gunpowder from everybody,
Right.
but most of these farmers hunted, had their own way of having gunpowder and so forth. But
Right.
why did we lack the formula?
Okay. The formula, the 1, 1, and 6 ratio, from what I understand, and I haven't looked this up recently, but I think in England that was pretty much established, just agreed upon in the 1600s. I know there are gunpowder folks out here. And so I think the formula was well established before the revolution. It's just getting people to make the stuff was the hard part. It's one thing to put stuff together, and I'm going to look at some of the gunpowder folks here, but you also, it's not just you put it in a mixing bowl and stir it up. It's got to be converted into the right size of grains for the particular weapon that's going to be used. Different weapons needed it in different sizes. I'm getting nods here. And not everyone can do that. And so Cressy's point about, it was harder to do than amateur enthusiasts thought, he was on target there. Okay, there was another question?
Yeah, hi. I was under the impression for a long time that gunpowder was, of course, it's made of potassium nitrate, sulfur, and charcoal. But I was under the impression that the potassium nitrate or saltpeter you could actually mine it. I know it's a process from guano, but I didn't think you made it. This is kind of a new, really important idea.
Yeah.
And wow, it really made it different here in America.
Right.
You had to make it to use it.
Okay, so there is naturally occurring saltpeter. Thomas Jefferson got reports in like Western Virginia, there being caves with naturally occurring saltpeter. And that is great because one, the British aren't gonna like intercept ships or claim this cave. But the problem is there's not enough of this naturally occurring that people knew about. And even once you scoop that up, you still have to purify it. Now they had some of them had the purification steps down right, but other folks, if they followed the wrong instructions, wouldn't get as much bang out of it. But yes, there is naturally occurring saltpeter.
Now, what about guano? How did they use that? It was processed, obviously.
Right. So the question has to do with guano. Okay, we're testing the liberal arts education that I've promoted for my career. Guano, bird feces. Well, the guano I know of comes from islands off the coast of Peru. Huge mountains of guano that were turned in, like nitrogen was somehow extracted from it and turned into explosives. Haber-Bosch process? You know something about this? Okay, I can tell you a book that I know of about guano, and send me an email. I'm the only Hsiung at Juniata, and I'll get the citation to you. But guano, from what I understand, 19th century, and the key thing is nitrogen. Huge amounts, huge amounts.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you. So you started off with your first slide, and it was the Battle of Lexington. So you're saying that everyone just rushed out of their house with the gun that they had, and the other gentleman is saying they would have brought with them the supplies they had for their gun, which was completely particular to the type of, the granulation of the, the nitrate, the phosphate nitrate. So what are the other things that also would have limited them as well? I mean, they are all some form of a musket ball, And do you need anything else to ignite? I mean, they would have just run out of supplies so quickly. But the British would have too, because they only have enough coming over on the ships for what they think they're going to need. And this was a surprise for them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So the Minutemen and the militia probably brought whatever supplies they individually or their militia company had stocked away. And in the months leading up to April 1775, there was a lot of anxiety in the Boston area about what is General Gage and the regulars, what are they going to do? Are they going to grab our supplies of gunpowder? So supplies were kind of hidden away in different communities. So they might have had more available to them than what they might just typically have for their own purposes. But they certainly did not have enough for an extended campaign. British certainly had more. They got more. There was like 6,000 some soldiers in Boston, and so they had more supplies. British Navy had control over the seas, so they could bring in more supplies of gunpowder. Almost all of British supplies of gunpowder came from Northeast India. And so that's a whole nother project I'm interested in. What was the environmental effect on India of making all of that gunpowder? I mean, if you're going to boil solution to purify it, that's cutting down a lot of trees. Was there deforestation in India? You know, we often think of India and maybe tea, East India Tea Company, but thinking about India in terms of gunpowder is another way of broadening our way of thinking about the war and of the revolution.
And Dave, on that note, I found you from a recommendation from an academic who actually was studying powder houses, colonial powder. Many of the towns around here have either a remains of a powder house, or where I live in Dedham, they have reconstructed one. And this person said, "Oh, I can't make it, but I know this guy who's even better than me," and here you are. Yeah. So that idea of putting the powder in one place is...
I guess we're done here. I mean, keep the lights on for two more?
Yeah, two more. That's
two
perfect,
more?
if we have any.
If you have them.
All right, I'll come to the front.
So I think you've kind of maybe addressed what I'm going to try to ask, but I'm thinking about Lexington and Concord was about the British regulars trying to seize weapons and gunpowder. And you framed the saltpeter as sort of a proxy for support, perhaps, of independence. So I'm kind of wondering, were there possibly any examples of sabotage or those who were not only not sufficiently motivated to produce saltpeter, but actually wanted to hinder it because they didn't want this, these rebels.
Yeah. I can't think right now of concrete examples, but there were certainly spies, Americans who were spies for Britain, and British who were spies for the U.S. side, the rebel side. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there was sabotage. I just right now can't think of an example, but it seems likely.
One more.
When did the DuPonts build their mill on the Brandywine to get enough powder? That was their first business, I believe.
The DuPont family started making gunpowder back on the Brandywine River.
I think it was early 1800s, 18aughts, 18 teens, in Delaware. I think it's where DuPonts were based. So from what I understand, after the revolution. Okay? Thank you for taking the time to come here tonight. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.